Attitudes, behavior, and rationalization. Throughout America's long and painful military involvement in Vietnam, a conflict that split the nation into hawks and doves, consumed the energies of 3 administrations, and ultimately cost the lives of 58,000 U.S. soldiers. The government put a positive spin on the enterprise, but despite the government's many positive pronouncements about the war effort, many government officials had doubts. Their reservations often surfaced when key decisions needed to be made, such as whether to increase the number of U.S. soldiers stationed in South Vietnam or whether to initiate a bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. president responsible for the largest buildup of American troops in Vietnam, used an interesting tactic to deal with those in his administration who had begun privately to express such reservations. Johnson would send the doubters on a fact-finding mission to Vietnam, nearly always accompanied by a group of reporters. This might seem like a risky move on Johnson's part, because if any of these doubters expressed their concerns to the press, the administration's policies would be undermined. Johnson knew, however, that they wouldn't express their dissent publicly and, moreover, when confronted by criticism of the war by reporters, would actually be put in the position of publicly defending administration policy. This public endorsement, Johnson reasoned, would serve to lessen their doubts and help transform them into advocates. Known as an unusually savvy politician, President Johnson was using some very clever psychology. Psychology we'll explore in this chapter to win support for his Vietnam policy. Outline: components and measurement of attitudes, predicting behavior from attitudes, predicting attitudes from behavior, self-perception theory, beyond cognitive consistency to broader rationalization. Johnson's strategy highlights some important questions about the consistency between attitudes and behavior, especially whether the consistency between the two is the result of attitudes influencing behavior or behavior influencing attitudes. Both types of influence occur. Attitudes influence behavior. Those with strong pro-environment attitudes are more likely to vote Green or Democratic than Republican, but behavior influences attitudes as well. Environmentally minded individuals who drive gas-guzzling cars tend to convince themselves that automobile exhaust contributes very little to air pollution or global warming, or that they don't drive that much anyway. Which is stronger, the effect of attitudes on behavior or the effect of behavior on attitudes? It's a difficult question to answer, but decades of research on the topic have shown that the influence of attitudes on behavior is a bit weaker than most people suspect, and the influence of behavior on attitudes is much stronger than most suspect. So President Johnson was right. Get skeptics to publicly endorse the policy, and they will be skeptics no longer. This chapter examines what social psychologists have learned about the consistency between attitudes and behavior. This chapter also examines 2 consistency theories that explain why people tend to maintain consistency among their attitudes and between their attitudes and behavior. Public advocacy and private acceptance. Despite continuing problems in fighting the Vietnam War, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson publicly declared that things were going well and insisted that his advisors and cabinet members publicly express their support and confidence. A. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had reservations about the war that may have been alleviated by the constant necessity of defending it. Here he is shown briefing the press on U.S. air attacks. B. To bolster morale, Johnson himself spoke to American troops in South Vietnam while U.S. General William Westmoreland, South Vietnamese General Nguyen Van Thieu, South Vietnamese Premier Nguyen Cu Khai, and U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk looked on. Components and measurement of attitudes. Let's start with the basics. What are attitudes and how are they measured? Attitudes can have multiple components, and researchers use a variety of different methods to measure them. Attitude, an evaluation of an object in a positive or negative fashion that includes 3 components: affect, cognition, and behavior. An attitude is an evaluation of an object along a positive-negative dimension. At their core, then, attitudes involve affect, emotion, how much someone likes or dislikes an object, be it a politician, a landscape, an athlete, athletic shoe, a dessert, or oneself. Nearly every object triggers some degree of positive or negative emotion, which constitutes the affective component of the attitude somebody has toward it. But attitudes also involve cognitions, thoughts that typically reinforce a person's feelings. These include knowledge and beliefs about the object, as well as associated memories and images. Your attitude about a favorite city, for example, includes knowledge about its history and its most appealing neighborhoods and landmarks, as well as the special times you've spent there. Finally, attitudes are associated with specific behaviors. Most generally, the affective evaluation of good versus bad is connected to a behavioral tendency to either approach or avoid. Put differently, attitudes alert us to rewarding objects we should approach and to costly or punishing objects we should avoid. When specific attitudes are primed, brought to mind even unconsciously, people are more likely to behave in ways consistent with the attitude. Neuroscientific studies indicate that our attitudes activate particular brain regions, areas of the motor cortex, that support specific actions. When you see a young child crying or a scrumptious hot fudge sundae, your mind prepares your body for the action of caretaking or consumption. Objects trigger emotions. Like most objects, this image of a tropical beach likely triggers some degree of emotion, presumably positive emotion for most of us. Measuring attitudes. Attitudes are most commonly determined through simple self-report measures, such as survey questions. When researchers want to know how participants feel about members of other groups, their romantic partners, a public figure, and so on, they usually just ask them. To do so, they often rely on a Likert scale, named after psychologist Rensis Likert, its inventor. A Likert scale lists a set of possible answers with anchors on each extreme. For example, 1 equals strongly disagree, 7 equals strongly agree. So, for example, to assess attitudes toward the use of cell phones while driving, researchers might have participants respond on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is the least favorable answer, it's never acceptable, and 7 is the most favorable, it's always acceptable. You've probably responded to many of these kinds of queries, yet when it comes to many complex attitudes, such as your attitude toward capital punishment, environmentalism, or hedge fund managers, responses to these sorts of simple scales are likely to miss some important elements. Likert scale, a numerical scale used to assess people's attitudes, a scale that includes a set of possible answers with labeled anchors on each extreme. Consider the following questions. How much do you value freedom? How strongly do you feel about the need to reduce discrimination? How important is a less polluted environment? If an investigator asked these questions of a random selection of individuals, chances are most responses on a Likert scale would be very positive. But surely people differ in the strength and depth of their attitudes toward these issues. How can social psychologists better capture these other dimensions of attitudes? One approach is to measure the accessibility of the attitude, how readily it comes to mind. To do so, researchers track the time it takes a person to respond to an attitude question, known as the person's response latency. Someone who takes less than a second to respond affirmatively to a question such as, "Do you approve of how the president is handling the economy?" is likely to have a stronger attitude on this topic than somebody who takes several seconds to respond. In a study conducted 5 months before Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale squared off in the 1984 U.S. presidential election, for example, Fazio and Williams, 1986, measured how long it took participants to indicate their attitude toward Reagan. Response latency, the amount of time it takes to respond to a stimulus, such as an attitude question. Those who responded quickly to the attitude question showed greater consistency between their attitude and how they ultimately voted compared with those who responded relatively slowly. A second way to assess the strength and importance of someone's attitude is to determine the centrality of the attitude to the person's belief system. To evaluate attitude centrality, researchers measure a variety of attitudes within a domain and calculate how strongly each one is linked to the others. To illustrate, a researcher might ask your opinions about abortion, stem cell research, fracking, same-sex marriage, sex education in high school, drug legalization, and taxation. If your attitude on a specific topic is very important to you, it should be consistent with your attitudes about certain other issues. For example, if abortion is a defining issue for you, then your view on abortion is likely to be strongly correlated with your attitudes about stem cell research and sex education, or perhaps even with your attitudes about same-sex marriage and taxation. Other ways of measuring attitudes don't rely on explicit self-reports. Investigators often use implicit attitude measures when there is reason to believe that people may be unwilling or unable to report their true feelings or opinions. Chapter 11 on Stereotypes and Prejudice discusses in detail two widely used implicit measures, affective priming and the implicit association test. With both of these measures, people don't realize that their attitudes are being examined. Implicit measures let researchers tap non-conscious attitudes, that is, people's immediate evaluative reactions they may not be aware of, or that may conflict with their consciously endorsed attitudes. Researchers also sometimes use nonverbal measures, such as degree of physical closeness, as signals of positive attitudes towards others. Finally, physiological indicators, such as the increased heart rate and sweaty palms associated with fear, can capture people's attitudes. Box 7.1, for example, describes how patterns of brain activity recorded from the surface of the scalp reflect the relative strength of positive and negative attitudes. Looking back, attitudes can have three components: affect, cognition, and behavior. Researchers have developed many ways to measure attitudes, including explicit self-reports, implicit indices, and physiological measures. Box 7.1, Focus on Neuroscience. Is the bad stronger than the good? At the core of our attitudes is a positive or negative response to an attitude object: an old friend's voice, a roommate's messy pile of dishes, the smell of freshly cut grass. Pioneering research by neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has found that one part of the brain, the amygdala, is central to this initial core component of our attitudes. After receiving sensory information about a stimulus from the thalamus, the almond-shaped amygdala then provides information about the positive or negative valence or value of the object. This evaluation occurs, remarkably, before the mind has categorized the object in question. Thus, even before we fully know what an object is, we have a gut feeling about it. When the amygdala is damaged, animals no longer have appropriate evaluations of objects. They eat feces, attempt to copulate with members of other species, and show no fear of threatening stimuli, such as snakes or dominant animals. Ledoux's research raises an interesting question. Are our quick positive and negative evaluations of stimuli comparable with respect to their strength? Reviews by Shelley Taylor, 1991, Paul Rosen and Edward Rosieman, 2001, Roy Baumeister and his colleagues, 2001, and John Cacioppo and Wendy Gardner, 1999, have all yielded the same answer. Negative evaluations are stronger than positive evaluations. It would certainly make evolutionary sense for an organism to be more vigilant about avoiding harm than seeking pleasure, to be more watchful for danger signs than for cues to opportunity. Food or mating opportunities not pursued today might be realized tomorrow. If a predator is not avoided today, there is no tomorrow. A pronounced negativity bias might therefore increase the chances of survival. Consider a few generalizations supporting the conclusion that the bad is stronger than the good. Negative stimuli, such as frightening sounds or noxious smells, elicit more rapid and stronger physiological responses than positive stimuli, such as delicious tastes. Losing $20 is more painful than winning $20 is pleasurable. Negative trauma, such as the death of a loved one or sexual abuse, can change a person for a lifetime. Positive events don't appear to have equivalent effects. Or consider Rosen's observation about contamination. The briefest contact with a cockroach will spoil a delicious meal, but the inverse, making a pile of cockroaches delicious by spicing it up with your favorite foods, is unimaginable. In related work, Tiffany Ito, John Cacioppo, and their colleagues presented participants with positively valenced pictures, pizza or a bowl of chocolate ice cream, for instance, and negatively valenced slides, such as photos of a mutilated face or a dead cat. As they did so, they recorded the participants' brain activity on the scalp and studied brain regions known to be involved in evaluative responses to stimuli. They discovered a clear negativity bias in evaluation. The negative stimuli generated greater brain activity than the positive or neutral stimuli. In this context, it seems that the bad is indeed stronger than the good. Predicting behavior from attitudes. Most academic discussions of how well attitudes predict behavior begin with a remarkable study conducted by the sociologist Richard Lapierre in the early 1930s. Lapierre spent 2 years touring the United States with a young Chinese couple, visiting numerous hotels, camping grounds, restaurants, and cafes. Although prejudice and discrimination against Chinese individuals were common at the time, Lapierre and his traveling companions were denied service by only one of the 250 establishments they visited, leading Lapierre to wonder if maybe anti-Chinese prejudice wasn't so strong after all. To find out, Lapierre wrote to all of the establishments they had visited and asked whether their policy was to serve Orientals. About 90% of the respondents said they wouldn't, a figure stunningly inconsistent with what Lapierre had actually experienced during his initial tour. This result was unfortunate in human terms because it indicated that anti-Chinese prejudice was indeed rather robust, but it was also unfortunate from the perspective of psychological science because it suggested that attitudes don't predict behavior very well. To a scientific discipline that had treated attitudes as powerful determinants of people's behavior, this news was surprising and rather unsettling. Note that this inconsistency wasn't some fluke. Many studies conducted over the next several decades yielded similar results. As a much-cited review in the 1960s of the existing literature on attitudes and behavior concluded, the present review provides little evidence to support the postulated existence of stable underlying attitudes within the individual, which influence both his verbal expressions and his actions. Attitudes don't always predict behavior. This bar in Pattaya Beach, Thailand, displays a sign declaring "No Arab to sit down here." The bar owners may indeed intend to block Arabs from their establishment, but if an Arab walked into the bar with some friends, would the owners really forbid the person from sitting down? No Arab to sit down here. We do not want Arab people consuming alcohol and accosting women. We respect your belief in Islam. Thank you. Many people find this result surprising because everyday life provides lots of evidence that attitudes and behavior often do go together. People who picket abortion clinics have anti-abortion attitudes. People who show up at the local bowling alley have positive attitudes toward the sport. Families with lots of kids usually have favorable attitudes about children. Evidence of a tight connection between attitudes and behavior is all around us. But such evidence indicates only that if people behave a certain way, they probably have positive feelings about that behavior. It doesn't mean that those with a positive attitude toward a given behavior will necessarily behave in a manner consistent with that attitude. What's not so obvious in everyday life are that many instances of, say, people with positive attitudes about bowling who don't bowl, or people with favorable attitudes about kids who don't have children. There are many reasons for failing to act on our attitudes, and once we're aware of all these reasons, the finding that attitudes so often fail to predict behavior may no longer seem so surprising. Furthermore, an awareness of these reasons gives us a better understanding of when attitudes are likely to be highly predictive of behavior and when they aren't. Attitudes can conflict with other powerful determinants of behavior. Think about the relationship between a person's attitudes about dieting and actual success in sticking to a diet. Would you expect a strong relationship? Probably not. Eating less is determined by so many things other than a person's attitude about dieting, including eating habits, individual physiology, and whether a roommate happens to be picking out at the moment, not to mention the person's attitude about things like ice cream, donuts, and French fries. What's true about attitudes toward dieting is true about attitudes in general. They all compete with other determinants of behavior. The situationist message of social psychology and of this book suggests that attitudes don't always win out over these other determinants, and hence attitudes aren't always tightly connected to behavior. One potent determinant of a person's actions that can weaken the relationship between attitudes and behavior is that person's understanding of the prevailing norms of appropriate behavior. You might be dying to share your hilarious commentary about the movie with the guy next to you in the theater, but let's hope you refrain from doing so because you recognize it just isn't done, and others, probably including the guy next to you, would disapprove. Similarly, the hotel and restaurant owners in Lapierre's study may have wanted to turn away the Chinese couple, but refrained from doing so out of concern for how it would look and the scene it might cause. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell, but this I know and know full well. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. Nursery rhyme written in 1680 by satiric poet Tom Brown after being threatened with dismissal by the dean of his college, Dr. Fell of Christ Church, University of Oxford. Introspecting about the reasons for our attitudes. Consider your attitude towards someone to whom you're attracted. Why are you attracted to that person? A number of answers likely spring to mind. She's cute, she's ambitious, he's fun to be with. Sometimes, however, it's not so easy to know exactly why we like someone. It may not be because of specific, readily identifiable attributes. We may simply share some indescribable chemistry. Suppose this is the case and you're asked to come up with reasons why you like your romantic partner. Like most people, you'll probably focus on what is easy to identify, easy to justify, and easy to capture in words, and thus miss the real, but hard to articulate, reasons for your attraction. Why does this matter? It turns out that coming up with the wrong reasons for an attitude you have can mislead you about what your attitude actually is. In one test of this phenomenon, Timothy Wilson and his colleagues asked students about the person they were dating. Participants in one group simply gave an overall evaluation of their relationship. Those in another group listed the reasons they felt the way they did and then gave an overall relationship evaluation. The researchers contacted the participants again 9 months later and asked about the status of their relationship. The attitudes of participants in the first group, who evaluated the relationship without considering their reasons, were much more accurate predictors of their current relationship status than the attitudes of participants who had introspected about their reasons for liking their partner. Thinking about why we like someone can mislead us in terms of our true, full attitude toward that person, making the attitude we report after generating reasons not a very good predictor of our subsequent behavior. Wilson has found that introspecting about the reasons for our attitudes about all sorts of things can undermine how well those attitudes guide our behavior. The cause in all cases is the same. Introspection may lead us to focus on the easiest to identify reasons for liking or disliking something at the expense of the real reasons for our likes and dislikes. Inconsistent attitudes. Attitudes may not be good predictors of behavior because people often have attitudes that conflict with one another. Eliot Spitzer, disgraced former governor of New York, had campaigned on the importance of high ethical standards among public officials and vowed to change the ethics of Albany. Following reports that he was a frequent customer in a high-priced prostitution operation, he resigned. Did he think his involvement with prostitutes was wrong but did it anyway? Or did he view participation in the sex trade as ethically acceptable? Does this mean that introspection is always or even typically harmful? Should we always just go with our gut? Not at all. In deciding whether to launch a military campaign, for example, it's imperative for analysts to exhaustively consider the reasons for and against the campaign. Also, the real reasons for our attitudes are sometimes perfectly easy to identify and articulate, and in those cases, introspection produces no rift between the things we think are guiding us and those that actually are. The contaminating effect of introspection is limited to those times when the true source of our attitude is hard to pin down, as when the basis of an attitude is largely affective, emotional. In such cases, a cognitive, thoughtful analysis is likely to seize on seemingly plausible but misleading cognitive reasons. When the basis of an attitude is primarily cognitive, however, the search for reasons tends to yield the real reasons, and introspection isn't likely to mislead us about our true attitude or diminish the relationship between our attitude and behavior. Thus, examining your reasons for enjoying a certain artist's work may cause a rift between your expressed attitude and your subsequent behavior, but analyzing why you prefer one digital camera over another probably won't create such a gap. The mismatch between general attitudes and specific targets. Typically, the attitudes people express are about general categories such as the environment, pushy people, French cuisine, or global trade. But the attitude-relevant behavior that researchers typically assess has a more specific focus: donating to Greenpeace, reacting to a specific pushy individual, ordering steak frites, or picketing a meeting of the World Trade Organization. Given this mismatch between general attitudes and specific behaviors, no wonder attitudes don't always predict behavior particularly well. Studies have shown that highly specific attitudes typically do a better job of predicting specific behaviors, and general attitudes typically do a better job of predicting how a person behaves in general. In Lapierre's study, for example, the attitudes expressed by the various merchants were rather general, whether they would serve Orientals, but the behavior assessed was directed at one specific Chinese couple with a specific demeanor and dressed in a specific fashion. Perhaps the results would have been different if Lapierre had asked the merchants whether they would serve a well-dressed, pleasant Chinese couple. If you want to predict a specific type of behavior accurately, you have to measure people's attitudes toward that specific behavior. General attitudes and specific targets. A person with a generally positive attitude about science may not participate in rallies and marches associated with the March for Science movement that was launched in 2017. But someone with more specific attitudes about the importance of science to the health and well-being of the world's population is more likely to join in a rally, like this person marching in a rally in Washington, D.C. Science is the key to our future. The broader point here is that what most people usually think of as attitudes about different classes of people, places, things, and events are often expressions of attitudes about a prototypical example of a given category. So if we encounter a specific situation or person who doesn't fit the prototype, our behavior probably won't reflect our stated attitude. Our general attitude doesn't apply to that particular person. Consider a study in which male college students express their attitudes about gay men. The researchers also elicited from each student his stereotype of the typical gay man. 2 months later, a different experimenter asked the participants if they would be willing to show some visiting students around campus. One of the visitors, John B., was described in such a way that the participants would think he was gay. For half the participants, the rest of the description of John B. was crafted to fit their own individualized stereotype of a gay man. For the other half, it wasn't. The investigators found that the students' willingness to show John B. around campus, their behavior, was strongly predicted by their attitudes about gay men. Those with positive attitudes said they were willing, those with negative attitudes said they were not, but only if John B. matched their prototype of a gay individual. If John B. didn't fit their image of a gay man, their attitudes about gay people didn't predict their behavior, their willingness to show him around campus. Looking back, attitudes can be surprisingly weak predictors of behavior. The reasons are that attitudes sometimes conflict with social norms about appropriate behavior. Examining the reasons for our attitudes can cause confusion about our true feelings. In general, attitudes sometimes don't correspond to the specific action being predicted in a given situation. Predicting attitudes from behavior. Many young people resent being sent to church, temple, mosque, or other religious service and often complain, "Why do I have to go? I don't believe any of this stuff." Many of them are told, "It doesn't matter if you believe it. What's important is that you continue with your studies and your prayers." Some resist to the very end and abandon all religious rituals and practices the minute their parents give them permission to opt out. But a remarkable number stick with it and eventually find themselves genuinely holding some of the very religious convictions they once resisted. Over time, mere outward behavior can give way to genuine belief. The previous section presented the first part of the story about the connection between attitudes and behavior. Attitudes can predict behavior, but not as strongly as most people suspect. The second part of the story, as illustrated by the religion example just described, is that behavior can powerfully influence attitudes. Social psychology research over the past half-century has repeatedly shown that people tend to bring their attitudes in line with their actions. How is it that our behavior has such a strong influence on our attitudes? A number of important theories seek to explain this relationship. Referred to collectively as cognitive consistency theories, they maintain that the impact of behavior on attitudes reflects the powerful tendency we have to justify or rationalize our behavior and to minimize any inconsistencies between our attitudes and actions. We focus here on the most influential of these theories, cognitive dissonance theory. Behavior can influence attitudes. Many people who consider themselves environmentalists nonetheless drive gas-guzzling SUVs. Driving a vehicle that isn't fuel efficient can lead those who are concerned about the environment to convince themselves that there isn't much connection between fuel efficiency and air pollution or climate change. Cognitive dissonance theory. Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory is one of the most significant theories in the history of social psychology. Festinger maintained that people are troubled by inconsistency between their thoughts, sentiments, and actions, and that they'll expend psychological energy to restore consistency.